Welcome, foreign entanglements viewers. Welcome to the post-Brexit vote world. Here in the United States, things seem to remain relatively calm. There are a few fires and not a stunning number of riots, and the dollar only keeps climbing with respect to the pound. So, with me today to talk about the consequences of Brexit is Nick Clark. He was recently on Foreign Entanglements to talk about other matters related to the European Union, and now we're going to talk about the catastrophe that has ensued. So, how are you doing today, Nick?
I'm okay.
Right. Yeah. And could you introduce?
I'm sort of in shock. But
what's that? You're still in shock?
Yeah. I can't believe it. Game of Thrones finale from last night.
That we can talk about too. But could you introduce yourself again? Remind people who you are.
Yeah, I'm Nick Clark. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Susquehanna University, which is a small liberal arts college in central Pennsylvania. My research and teaching focuses, at least in part, on the European Union and on public opinion and voting behavior within the EU and the United States.
Great. So let's start off with just a basic recap. What happened on Thursday, both in terms of sort of the institutional and the voting part of it? I mean, so where are we now?
So the United Kingdom held a referendum on whether to leave the European Union. The movement to leave prevailed by some 4%, so roughly 52 to 48% in favor of leaving. That is a non-binding referendum, and while there's some discussion that's emerging about ways around it, it still remains somewhat difficult to imagine a scenario where the United Kingdom does not follow the results of that referendum and in fact leave the European Union. And certainly a lot of leaders within the EU are pushing for a quick exit. They're exit than some of the leaders of the Leave campaign wanted.
Right now, so that's interesting to me. Now, why are you seeing a movement within Europe to push? And can you also explain what because people have been talking about Article 50, which is I guess apparently what triggers the exit or the formal exit of the United Kingdom. Why are leaders in Europe pushing for a quicker exit than Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and so forth are pushing in the UK?
Well, so Article 50 was inaugurated with the Treaty of Lisbon. It's a formal institution that allows a country to leave the EU. It's interesting because prior to that, there was no such institution. It wasn't really legally possible for a country to do so. Obviously it was politically possible, but that instrument wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And so it's very new. It was into place in 2009. And what it means, in fact, is that really the negotiations for the United Kingdom to leave can't begin until the UK invokes that article. So a lot of the leaders in Europe are trying to pressure the UK to move toward a fast exit, but really they have very little leverage because this referendum is non-binding, and until the UK decides to invoke that article, nothing changes. It sort of remains the status quo. Now, obviously, on the ground, politically, things are changing. The United Kingdom's commissioner has resigned. There's already discussion that, British members of the European Parliament are already sort of being pushed aside, and even some British civil servants that are presumably hired to permanent positions within the EU are being told that they shouldn't count on their jobs. Some are being told that everything's going to be done to help preserve their jobs as possible, but there's a lot of anger right now in Europe. I recall talking about this possibility last March with my class, and I've thought all along, and I still think that it's very likely that if the UK leaves the EU, that everyone's going to ultimately push for the UK to enter an organization called the European Free Trade Association, or EFTA. That organization houses Switzerland and Norway, two other non-EU members, and it more or less gives single market access. It's not quite the same as if they were EU members, but it's close to it. And I think that's in everyone's interest for the United Kingdom to be in that organization if it leaves, because the UK obviously is going to want to continue to access European markets, and I think the UK itself is a large enough market that I don't see why the continent would ultimately want to forego that. But I also thought back then, and I myself thought that there'd be a lot of anger. I think there is. Cameron came to the rest of the leaders of Europe and said, "You have to give me a better deal." That was after the British already had a better deal than anyone else. They're not in the Eurozone. They're not in Schengen. They don't pay into the EU budget the same percentage as anyone else because they had already negotiated an exemption. So they already sort of had special treatment. He demanded more special treatment. the leaders of Europe gave him as much as they felt they could, right? And still, of course, the vote went the way it did. Now, obviously, that's because of the public and not because of Cameron. There's a lot of anger. I think a lot of the continent, particularly the leaders and elites on the continent, are really kind of tired of dealing with the British. And so there's a push on the part of most of the leaders within the EU, although Donald Tusk is I think trying to interject some sort of caution and slowness into the process, but certainly on the part of Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the Commission, and on other leaders, there's a push to get them out as soon as possible. If you don't want to be part of this, you won't. And there's discussion that they're not going to give Britain a sort of Norway or Switzerland-like arrangement because they're afraid that's going to inspire other countries to leave, where the countries think that they'll retain the benefits of being in the EU but not have to pay any of the costs.
Right, right. And so that was actually going to be my next question, right? How much of this anger is just sort of righteous emotional anger, and how much of this is calculated to demonstrate to other people who might try to or other countries that might try to do this sort of thing that this is really a terrible mistake, right? So how much is really an interest in punishing Great Britain as punishing the United Kingdom as a message to other sort of wayward states?
Well, I think it's definitely the latter. I think it's for sure a calculated strategic move to try and prevent a snowball effect. And they've said as much, so that's why it's easy to say that. It's, of course, very difficult to figure out if or how much righteous emotional anger is factored into it if you're not on the ground in the room with those players. I will say I think there's a bit of it because you have some European leaders that are pushing for as much. In fact, some European leaders who are cautioning against that sort of righteous emotional anger, like Angela Merkel. So she, I think, perceives that to be the case among some European leaders. And I'll say I see it because I'm not of the opinion this is a done deal. It most likely is, right? There's not much room in there to go back. But that said, the EU has a long history of having referenda that they lose, right? There have been at least half a dozen treaty referenda for major treaties that needed to be passed, at least 2 in Ireland, where they held the referendum, and the vote was against the EU. It was a vote against ratification. And the same general sort of period of reflection occurs afterwards, where everyone acknowledges that the EU didn't do enough, that the government didn't do enough, that it was a poor campaign, that the public wasn't educated enough. And then they schedule a second referendum, and then it passes in the second referendum. This is a pattern that's occurred.
Right.
Now, this is obviously very different. This has more significance than Ireland voting not to ratify the Treaty of Lisbon, right? So I think it's harder for individuals to imagine this playing out in the same way. But that said, there is precedent there. There's obviously right now, I think, a lot of regret on the continent right now. You know, it's hard to tell. You couldn't bet one way or the other because it was always going to be close, but there seemed to be a lot of people that supported leaving that are maybe having second thoughts about that. Legal theory suggests that if you're going to have a popular referendum like this on a decision as momentous as this, that you have certain threshold if it doesn't hit 75% participation. And of course, this one came close.
Right.
Or if the margin is not large enough, meaning like 65% say vote for a particular action, that you schedule a second one. Right. Because you don't want decisions as large as this to be sort of subject to momentary public whims. So that's all my way of saying is I don't think that this has to be a done deal yet. It most likely is. But I would think if I were in Brussels that I'd want to play it a little bit more carefully right now rather than adding more fuel to the fire by saying, fine, if you don't want to be here, then just leave, which is kind of what some of the leaders there are doing.
Right. Now, with respect to what's going on in the United Kingdom right now, Cameron made clear that he's not going to invoke Article 50, right? That he's not going to be the one to do that, that a successor will do that. And so does that? I was a little bit unclear on the status of this. Does that mean there's going to be another general election in the United Kingdom, or is it just going to be a leadership election for the Tories that will lead to Boris Johnson or someone who will then invoke Article 50 or not?
Well, both are possibilities right now. The most likely possibility is that there will be a leadership election within the Conservatives, and a new prime minister will be selected from amongst them. Right? What's in some speculation that Boris Johnson and Gove and some other prominent members of the Leave campaign who have been saying,
we wanted Cameron to stay on, and who have also been saying we think that we should take 2 or 3 years to negotiate the best possible exit. The speculation is that they never wanted Cameron to leave because they recognize that there could be a lot of negative fallout from this, and they don't want to take responsibility for it, right? So if Cameron stays on, and if Cameron is the one that invokes the article and negotiates to leave, then anything bad that comes from it is completely on Cameron's shoulders. Whereas if Boris Johnson takes over, he invokes the article, and the pound collapses even more, right? Or we see further negative consequences, then it's hard not for more of that to sort of fall on his shoulders. And so there's some speculation that that's why the lead campaign, who you might think would want to leave as soon as possible, are the ones that are pushing to stay on longer. But the second is, in fact, a possibility that there could be new elections triggered. It's a far more remote possibility, and it would basically involve defections from the Conservatives. And that's not unimaginable. A number of Conservatives support the EU. They support the United Kingdom being a member. They come from districts which heavily voted in favor of staying in the EU. The Liberal Democratic Party, the Lib Dems, are big EU supporters. They have, in fact, taken on previously Conservative members in the past. It's not unimaginable that there are defections to that party, particularly if you see Boris Johnson really emerge as the lock, as that's gradually happening. And if they don't have enough seats in Parliament then to secure a majority, then you're going to have new elections. And in which case, particularly if Corbyn gets those forced out of Labour, that new election is going to become in of itself a second sort of referendum on this question.
Now, I mean, could it also go the other way? So say that Johnson, Johnson does win the Conservative election, he does become Prime Minister, but then does not invoke Article 50, right? Could you have discontent from pro-exit Conservatives that might then lead to another election, or is that less likely?
I think it's less likely that he would do that. His preference might be to not have to be the one that invokes the article, and his preference might be to give it a few years, which I think is smart, honestly, from that perspective. But if he's put in the leadership seat, he can't, right? If he doesn't follow through on this, I think his political career is done right there, because this has become the foundation by which he has risen to power. So I think that the possibility that he comes to power and then does not invoke Article 50 is very, very remote.
Right.
But I think if he did, then you'd possibly have defections from him. Yes.
Right. Now, one of the commentators, actually at my website, called Johnson, right, the proverbial dog that somehow catches the car in the end, right? That suggesting that Brexit was sort of opportunistic on his part, and he wasn't really sort of ideologically committed to it. Do you have any sort of thinking along those lines, right? And that seems to, some of the later polling that's coming out of the United Kingdom seems to suggest that even large majorities of people who voted for Brexit did not expect to win, right? Did not expect Brexit to win. I mean, is this the kind of thinking that produces this two referendum structure, right, that has been over and over again in terms of the EU, where EU votes become a proxy for all sorts of discontent, but then people sort of stop and then revisit a little bit later, sort of really rethinking their interests?
Yeah. So before I say what I'm about to say, I want to acknowledge I can't underscore enough the fact that there is a significant percentage of the British people that don't like the EU,
right.
And with good reason. Don't think the country should be in it. Have fears related to immigration, about threats to national sovereignty, and so they went into it. They voted with a clear mind and with those ideas in place, right? But it was, 4% is not a narrow margin. That's a clear victory, but it's also, it's not a wide margin either, right? And it has become clear, I think, that some of the previous patterns that hold in European elections hold here. So in referenda on the European Union and questions about the EU, such as related to treaty ratification, as well as the elections to the European Parliament, we know that there's a sizable percentage of the public that usually uses those elections to cast a protest vote. They're not casting votes based on genuine sentiments about the EU itself. They're casting votes on whether they approve or not of the national government. And there's some evidence that at least some of the voters in this referendum were casting protest votes against Cameron because they didn't think there was any chance that the election would actually go this direction, right? So you have this whole protest vote constituency. You have a constituency of individuals that didn't quite understand what the EU was to begin with. That wasn't, it was at least on NPR and a couple of news sources that the most Googled topic the day after was, what is the EU?
Right.
There's a story that's circulating now about this county. I'm coming up blank on what it is, but this county that's really worried is going to lose its EU stipend now, which amounts to about $80 million annually.
Cornwall was in Cornwall, I believe.
Cornwall, right, yeah. And of course they're going to lose it. And apparently some members of the Remain campaign promised that it would get replaced. I'm assuming the logic there is that the British government would take what it was giving to the EU and instead, divvy that out to these different regions within the United Kingdom that are receiving EU subsidies. But there's no way. First of all, most of the Leave campaign, like Johnson, were not people in government.
Right.
There's no guarantee that any of these lost subsidies are going to be replaced by the British government. What we do have a guarantee of is those subsidies are lost. The EU is not going to keep giving money to British regions once the UK leaves. That's money that it gives to countries that are in the European Union. Right? So there's a fair amount of regret, I think. There's a fair amount of people saying, I didn't quite know what I was voting for. And so, I mean, again, I don't know that we could count on a second referendum producing a different result. I think there's at least a possibility of that.
Right. Now, what's the situation right now? Now, obviously, every component of the United Kingdom, other than England, voted for Remain by varying margins. Wales, less so, maybe something like 52-48, I think. Northern Ireland, not by a large margin, but they did vote Remain, and especially Scotland, and you probably know more about this than I do, but it was around 60-40 for Remain. Now, especially with respect to Scotland, what is the next step there? I mean, we're already talking about a second referendum for Scottish independence. Is that something that's really on the horizon right now?
Well, there are two paths forward that are not mutually exclusive. One is in the SNP leader, I think Sturgis, has been saying this, that the Scottish Parliament could presumably block this if they don't ratify. The other is, to schedule a second referendum and for Scotland to leave the United Kingdom and to join the EU. What's interesting is when Scotland held its own referendum 2 years ago, there was the elite consensus was against that, and so you had leaders from both parties in the UK campaigning against it, but you had leaders from Europe campaigning against it. And of course, the assumption of Scotland at the time was if they leave the UK, they can't immediately join the EU. And the EU was so against this that its leaders said, no, you're going to go to the back of the queue. And we have plenty of other membership applications we have to consider first. Now the narrative, to the extent that there is one coming out of Brussels, is slightly different. Right. You might expect. And I think it would emerge that way. I think if Scotland voted to leave, there'd be a sort of fast track toward enlargement that was put into place. Because I think the EU would see benefits to having Scotland in there, and Scotland certainly sees those benefits as well. And so it's a very different picture today surrounding Scottish independence. There's a lot of people, I think, that opposed Scottish independence previously who are thinking very differently about it right now. And so I fully expect at this point for there to be a second referendum. The question is whether it can do that without Westminster's blessing. The prior referendum was with the support of Cameron. He didn't support Scotland leaving, but he supported holding the referendum and respecting the result. That's not the situation today, and presumably Westminster would have to sign off on Scotland having a second referendum.
Right. And the other complication, of course, is that hydrocarbon prices have crashed, right? And high hydrocarbon prices helped drive some of the logic of Scottish exit previously, right? And so now Scotland faces, even with brighter prospects for entering the EU, Scotland faces bleaker economic prospects from separating from the United Kingdom. And so how those would play out is, really kind of interesting. Although you can imagine just the campaign for it, just a straightforward, clear set of campaign for Scottish exit at this point is that England is dragging us down, right? I mean, it seems, and here's a clear evidence of England dragging us down.
Well, so the EU has what are called net contributors and net beneficiaries. Net contributors are countries that give more into the EU budget than they receive back in the form of agricultural subsidies or regional subsidies for infrastructure and things like that. The United Kingdom was a net contributor, well, one of the highest, not the highest. I think Germany's the highest, but it was up there, right? As a net contributor, meaning it was getting more money in the EU, which was one thing that a lot of the elites there did not like. Scotland would almost definitely be a net beneficiary. I believe it would probably receive more money from the EU than would actually be giving into the EU. And if on top of that, it's benefiting from being a part of the Eurozone, which may emerge despite everything that's going on as our currency. It's hard to tell, but it's at least a possibility. You can imagine that there are a number of economic benefits for Scotland to joining the EU.
Right. And that would be obviously just staggeringly disruptive for everyone. So, I mean, what? I understand that there have been one of the immediate reactions from some other parties that are normally associated with the right, sort of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands and so forth, was to look into pursuing this same option in their own countries, right? So we already talked about how the EU has an absolute strong interest in preventing the next domino from falling. But what does that domino look like at this point? Like, what is the reaction of anti-EU constituencies on the continent in terms of trying to produce their own referendum, in terms of trying to produce their own exit from the European Union? Where are we looking next in terms of something happening to the EU?
I suspect it'll be in Eastern Europe. I mean, people focused on the Netherlands and France because you have prominent hard-right Eurosceptic leaders there in Wilders and Marie Le Pen.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously France and the Netherlands harbor their own Eurosceptic populations. Those are the two countries that voted down the proposed European Constitution back in 2004.
Mm-hmm.
Those were probably the last two most disastrous referenda that the EU's dealt with. But I just can't see the same result coming out of Dutch or French referenda. I think there are too many individuals, particularly in France, but even the Netherlands, who have benefited from it. They were founders of the EU. They have historic ties to it. You would see a significant percentage in either country vote against it, but I don't think it would come anywhere close to Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because there's this sort of tidal wave of anxiety that people studying the EU aren't anticipating. Britain has always harbored a much larger Eurosceptic population than the rest of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It's more or less the founding country when it comes to the Eurosceptic Party within the European Parliament. UKIP has been around, for over a decade. It's just not the same scenario. I think if we were to see dominoes, it'd be in Eastern Europe,
mm-hmm.
Where there are far higher levels of latent Euroscepticism that have been around for longer.
Mm-hmm.
There are countries that are on the front line and are dealing more with the migrant crisis, which definitely ties into this, and with governments that are themselves a bit more skeptical and harboring more extreme. So, I mean, if we see dominoes, I would expect them in Hungary, or I'd expect them in the Czech Republic. Now, of course, those are the countries that have more to lose because they're net beneficiaries.
Mm-hmm.
They're getting more money from the EU than they're giving in. So they're in a slightly different position than the United Kingdom on that front. But that's where I think the sort of foundations for a sort of successful referendum exist. I've seen some speculations of the North in Denmark and in Sweden. And Denmark has been sort of, along with the United Kingdom, another country that has,
Right.
I don't think it's harbored strong Euroscepticism, although it exists there, but it's definitely a country that it has not always gone along with the European project, right? It didn't want to be part of the Eurozone. It is resistant to overreach on the part of Brussels. But I don't think there again that we see the same sort of roots of Euroscepticism within the public, right? Now, of course, the possibility that I think everyone fears, people that study the EU, people that are working in the EU, is that this really is the start of some sort of groundswell, right? That this is a movement that's going to pick up supporters that aren't currently coming out within any sort of the data. And that's at least a possibility. That's the reason to be very anxious about what's going on. I think as of now, there's not strong evidence that that's going to occur, but that's of course obviously something that could happen in the future.
Now, what's been the reaction in Southern Europe, right? Sort of the victims of the Eurozone, right? The countries that have had their economies treated particularly problematically since the 2008 financial crisis. Because you didn't mention any of those, obviously Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece in what you were just talking about, right? Is there just not any interest in those places for this kind of way of escaping the EU?
I don't think so. I think that they want the EU to change. And that's been the reaction that we've seen out of some of those governments. There should be a wake-up call, right? That the EU isn't democratic enough, that the EU is trying to force too much on national governments. And especially, as you might expect out of Greece, there's been a great focus on sort of austerity budgets that were forced by the EU. So it's had the sort of lens or tone that you would expect from those countries. Greece, the question was always about whether they leave the Eurozone. Mm-hmm. There were some elements within Greece that wanted to leave the EU altogether,
But I think there's a pretty wide recognition there on the part of everyone that that would just be disastrous for Greece, right? So the idea was maybe we should take the drachma back, because with our own currency, we can, have another instrument of macroeconomic control over what's going on, but we don't want to lose the EU subsidies. I mean, Greece is also a net beneficiary. We don't want to the single market, right? So I don't think there's the same groundswell there for leaving as what we've seen elsewhere. I don't know that it exists in Spain. You occasionally hear about it in Italy. Mm-hmm. There are some Eurosceptic elements in Italy. I think they've elected some Eurosceptic members of the European Parliament. But
Italy is also a founding member of the community as well. So.
Yeah, and I think Italy recognizes that if it really wants to tackle the migrant crisis, and it has, for some time now really been at the forefront of that crisis, that it's going to need a European solution. It just, much like France and the Netherlands, it has historic ties. Italy's had, Italian politicians have been some of the most high-profile leaders within the EU over the last decade. So I would say, again, at the present time, even though there have been some tough times in those countries, the prospect of leaving the EU doesn't seem to be looming any more than it is in, say, the Netherlands or France.
Now, so a few reports have emerged, and this is something that we've known for quite some time, but it's interesting that a couple articles have come out about this in the past few days, about sort of Moscow's long-term support for Eurosceptic parties and how much money Moscow is pouring into Eurosceptic parties in the EU right now. I mean, is this something to take seriously as sort of a drive in Russian statecraft? Is there any actual impact of sort of Russian meddling in EU politics that's going to play any sort of consequential role? I mean, I don't think I've heard any plausible analysis that actually puts Moscow behind Brexit, but is Russia's meddling is such a loaded word, is Russia's influence going to have any kind of impact in how some of these developments sort of follow through?
I don't think so. I mean, if anything, outside of being a financial resource for some of these parties, and I don't think it's been all that much money,
mm-hmm.
They become an argument, right? The credibility of the lead the EU campaign, it's the credibility of the Eurosceptic elites members, is that they want to preserve national sovereignty.
Right.
And it's kind of hard to make that argument if you're clearly the puppet of another government that's trying to interfere in national affairs, right? So I think that there's a potential counter-narrative with all of that if that story sort of continues.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Brexit itself and the further breakup of the EU only serves Russia's interests,
mm-hmm.
right? Because the EU was formed, at least in part, and has been motivated over the years, at least in part, to ensure that there was a strong counterweight to the Soviet Union first and to Russia after that.
Mm-hmm.
That was certainly the U.S. interest in supporting the creation of the EU back in the 1950s, right? And I think that's still true today. We are continually tussling with Putin. And when I say we, I don't just mean, the United States, but the West more broadly, and the
right.
EU is a major partner in that. And the EU has taken on its own battles with Putin. So I think, it can only serve Putin's interest by having this level of disharmony within the EU. But the strength of the Eurosceptic parties lies with the faults and the flaws of the EU itself and the tides of consent amongst the European public. And so I just don't think that Russia has that much influence in things like the Brexit referendum or anything else like that.
Right, that makes sense. So, especially for, and I actually, if we could take this, I want to take this in two different directions, and you can sort of choose which one you want to go first. So, thinking about what Brexit means for the future of the European project, right? Are the people who work within and value and who sort of believe in the European Union? So I'm not talking here mainly about the scholarly community, but I'm talking about sort of, what the EU means on the ground. Are they now thinking about the future as, one of retrenchment, right? That we're, sort of stepping back and ensuring that we hold on to what we have and sort of prevent the further collapse. or are they thinking about it in some other way that doesn't even seem plausible to me? I mean, right now retrenchment seems the only thing you could be really thinking about right now if you're part of the EU, which is a sort of a dramatic counterweight to how things were back in 2004 when there was hope for the Constitution and all this stuff. So that's part one, and sort of part two, and I'm curious if you could address this, right? From a scholarly point of view, because this is what you do, right? I mean, is there any sort of concern within the community of scholars who studies the EU that we're looking at 1988 in terms of Soviet studies, right? That we're looking at something that's about to go away in a really dramatic fashion that nobody in this community really expected. And I don't mean to imply that you're going to be in an office next to a scholar of Soviet studies at some point in the future. But is there any sort of community is concerned within that community that this thing that we've studied for such a long time is a thing which is going to, in the next 10 years, be something primarily of historical interest?
Well, can I take a few minutes to talk to you about my research on local and state elections here in the United States? I think going back about 15 years in the EU, the sentiment on the ground, as near as I can tell, and it's hard to really characterize this because it's going to differ by country and by demographics and whatnot, but I never really thought it was that people thought the EU itself was a terrible thing, that their country should leave the EU. I do think that amongst a lot of people on the ground there was a sense that things were moving too fast. What's interesting is the Eurobarometer had two questions that it was asking forever. One is, do you think your country's membership in the EU is a good thing or bad thing? We talked about this in the last interview. They actually discontinued that question in 2010, even though it's the question that's been asked most consistently since the 70s. And I have to wonder why they did that. But another question is, do you think integration is moving too fast? And people put it on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of the speed at which they think it's moving and the speed that they desire. And within the public opinion data, I think, as well as people that you might talk to over in the EU, it wasn't always that people thought the EU was a bad thing, it was that they thought it was moving too fast. You had Eastern enlargement, you had the Eurozone, you had a rapid expansion of what the EU was from 1992 well into 2004, and I think people wanted some breathing space. And I don't know that they've gotten it. And so, I think that the number of people that would now say the EU is a bad thing has expanded. I think that's why the Eurobarometer, at least in part, is not asking that question anymore. So this sort of outright hard Euroscepticism where you just want to leave the EU altogether, that has grown a bit. But I still would believe that the vast preponderance of people, it's not that they want to leave, it's that they think that you need to slow down. And so I don't know if retrenchment's the right word, because then you're talking about a reversal. That's certainly a possibility. With some of the actions regarding Schengen last spring, I think that in itself a signal of reversal, where you had countries closing borders, at least in violation of the spirit of Schengen, even though there was a legal technicality that allowed that to occur. But I think that it's hard to imagine how we could see the EU growing anymore at this point.
Right.
Which is interesting because you have some calls for it to do so, that's how it has to respond to this crisis, right? But I think that amongst the public and with public sentiment, the best thing maybe the EU could do is sort of, this was unintentional, but what it did really in the 60s and 70s and early 80s was take a break and let things stand for a while, right? And that might be the best path right now, at least, absent anything that needs to be done to ensure and preserve the integrity of the EU, right?
Right.
I don't know that there's a lot of fear amongst scholars studying it. I haven't seen any discussions of this, so I'm not really speaking with a high degree of information. I think that there were some academic meetings taking place in Brussels around this, actually. The EU is still intact, so it's hard to react with that expectation or the fear that we might become sort of like the Sovietologists of the late 80s, because the EU is fully intact. It still has 28 members. If Britain leaves, which it likely will, it's hard to tell when it will or under what conditions, and if it's going to then have a sort of EFTA-like arrangement with the EU, it's definitely the project is in danger right now, but I don't know that it's in so much danger. Series intervening too. I don't know that it's in so much danger
that we can assume is going to go away at this point. And I think a lot of scholars that study the EU are also studying, they're studying West European politics or East European politics more broadly, and so their research in that vein is still going to be relevant. So at this point, I suspect there isn't any such fear, but again, I can't speak with full information there.
Right. All right, then. I guess now we can sort of go back. Is there anything else you want to say about the situation for right now? Like the things we should be looking for next, right? What are going to be the sort of tremendous decisions to be made within the next few months that are going to affect how all of this plays out, how all of Brexit plays out in its relationship with the EU? Is it primarily going to be this question of the English or of the British election, and whether Johnson triggers Article 50 and that sort of thing? Is that sort of really where the center of gravity for this event lies with Johnson and within the Conservative Party?
I think Scotland and Northern Ireland are where you can pay attention, because I don't think the British are going to move to replace Cameron anytime, or the Conservatives aren't going to replace him before November. I don't think Article 50 is going to be invoked before then. And there's nothing the leaders of Europe can say that's going to pressure Britain to move on that, right? If the leaders of Europe had that kind of influence on Britain and the leaders of Britain previously, then we wouldn't be in this situation. Right. So it doesn't matter how angry Juncker is, they're going to invoke Article 50 when they want to invoke Article 50, right? Scotland, however, could move quickly. I don't know that it will, but that's definitely a possibility. And what it does could trigger or precipitate other events, right, within British politics and European politics more broadly. So anyone that's looking for another sort of game-changing moment or where the action is going to occur now, I think Scotland's where you have to look, because I don't think we're going to see follow-up to this referendum with tangible action for some months.
All right, well, Nick, thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully something deeply exciting will happen in the next few months, and we can have you on again to sort of explain why this is collapsing this time. So, why
Game of Thrones?
We can talk. So, okay, well, let's talk about Game of Thrones at least for a bit. We have Nexit. We have once again Nexit. We thought we had escaped that. I suppose you can say the acclaiming of Jon Stark as the King of the North is the second referendum with respect to the North. The first referendum having been the acclaiming of Robb Stark as the King of the North. What did you think of last night's episode? Well, spoiler alert before you say anything. Anybody who hasn't watched it. So anyway, now go ahead.
You already spoiled it. I don't think anyone proclaimed him as Jon Stark. That's what was interesting. They kept using the name Jon Snow, so they're willing to follow someone that doesn't have a legal claim on that birthright, the birth name. But I don't know. I thought it was a logical setup for what comes next. Right? Basically, we pared it down to these three characters. There's basically you have the setup for a war of the three kings, right? With Cersei, Jon Snow, and Daenerys.
Right. Were you surprised by the finality of the resolution of the King's Landing storyline? Is that something they had been laying? Obviously, the groundwork in some sense. I'll confess, I was a little bit surprised by just how many characters were wiped out within. I mean, that happened even faster than the Red Wedding, right? In terms of simply annihilating a vast portion of the cast of Game of Thrones. Was that surprising at all to you, or did you really sort of foresee that happening?
It was surprising to me. It wasn't surprising once you thought back to it, and clearly Cersei had something she was planning previously, where she had this sort of rumor that she'd been exploring, and the rumor was that the Mad King's sort of green fire supplies, or whatever they're called, were under. But yeah, in the moment it was shocking. You were expecting some sort of trial to occur, right? And then obviously it was just within moments was all done. I mean, Marjorie saw it coming, so.
Right, Marjorie's conversation. I thought that was actually one of the best parts of the episode was Marjorie's conversation with the High Sparrow. Right, that's a great very political conversation. Right, she understands the consequences, and she's not here. There's a reason for that, and that was sort of a great sort of come to your senses moment, and it may be a conversation that I sort of try to use to explain political reality to people in the future. But it was. Fantastic, but we really lost. I mean, we lost a number of characters who had been in the show since the first season, right? I mean, from Lancel, obviously, Grand Maester Pycelle, Marjorie had been in the first season. I believe Mace Tyrell. I can't remember if he'd been in the first season or not, if he was from the second season. Kevin Lannister, who was a little bit later. The High Sparrow himself. Loras Tyrell. Tommen. Everybody dying in a very short period of time.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's maybe one of the more interesting outcomes of that is that sends, gosh, I can never remember, Lady Oleana or something, Marjorie's grandmother, down into an alliance with the new leadership in Dorne, who then apparently has entered into an alliance with Daenerys, right? And so I don't see how with that kind of alliance, Cersei has any chance, right? Seems to me like Daenerys could basically take over with the resources she has versus what have to be substantially dwindled resources throughout Westeros that she could already roll in. But if there's anyone that has sort of, human supply and material supply left with which to wage war, it would have to be, the Martells and the leaders of Dorne. I don't know what.
Well, the Martells are the leaders of Dorne. The Tyrells are the
Tyrells,
Reach.
yeah.
But what you have here, you have an alliance between the Targaryens, the Martells, and the Tyrells in the south, an alliance between the Aarons and the Starks in the north, and the Lannisters have no allies, right? I mean, they have no one. Even the Freys have been removed from the equation, right? And so they're essentially, which is sort of what Jaime Lannister pointed out, right? You're almost completely useless. You can't even hold your own lands. And so how they play sort of the remainder of this particular war out, right? It seems like Daenerys would land virtually unopposed and be able to defeat the Lannisters. We'll see how it actually goes in this sense, whether she threatens to destroy the rest of King's Landing. But from a political point of view, the cards are deeply stacked against, right? The question would be, how difficult is it going to be to bring the Vale and the North back into the fold, if that's what Daenerys really wants to do.
Yeah. Well, technically he's her nephew, right?
He is her nephew, but he is also, were his claim recognized, he is ahead of her on the Targaryen depth chart. So he would technically be the Targaryen king, assuming the relationship between Lyanna and Rhaegar were recognized.
Right. Right. They would have had to have been married, correct, for it to have any weight. I think
they would have had been married, and it's unclear. It's unclear in what we saw last night. It's unclear that they were married. So.
I think another interesting question is, can he also speak nice words to dragons as well?
Well, that's surely what we're going to find out, isn't it? Right? And we will see how that in particular plays out if he ever actually encounters dragons. And of course, Littlefinger remains a spoiler. There's all sorts of stuff left but certainly in terms of eliminating a significant number of storylines, Cersei accomplished that goal, right? Nobody cares about the High Sparrow anymore. This has become an irrelevant consideration. So,
yeah, thankfully.
I thought Jonathan Pryce was great, and say what you will about Jonathan Pryce, his costume budget was $40, right? That was the burlap sack with holes cut in it. That's his costume budget. So.
I liked the whole scene at the start where everyone was dressing, getting ready, because obviously it takes a lot of drama and time to put on that set, ever so carefully.
Right. All right. Well, Nick, thank you for joining us today, and for Entanglements viewers, thank you both for listening to the discussion of the EU, but also for having patience enough to listen to the discussion of Game of Thrones as well. And hopefully, we will talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.